planning research, which is relevant to today's talk, transactional family processes supporting father involvement, and fostering healthy futures with Heather Tosick here at Denver. So it was at Denver that she got her PhD in social work in 2019. And we were so super lucky to have hired her at that point. You know, and I have to say, she's been working on 2 programs here within IBS. One is the middle school life skills training implementation. They were sitting on a mountain of data, and Katie's been helping them look through that and say, what are the most interesting questions that we can answer given these data? And then we hired her on a randomized controlled trial of a high school life skills training. And I don't have enough time today, but I can't tell you how many times she saved our butt on that project, because we're trying to do this high school implementation during COVID. It's just been a nightmare, and Katie has been fabulous. So anyway, her talk today, on June 24th, the Supreme Court in a 5-4 decision written by Samuel Alito rescinded Roe v. Wade, which pushes back into the national discussion issues of reproductive rights and fairness and how that affects the most vulnerable among us. And that has been a consistent theme through all of Katie's work, is to say, how do we think about healthcare for the most vulnerable? And I think I would leave it with that. So what she's going to be presenting on today is on the work that she's done with, I think it was a seed grant supported by IBS. And now she's leveraged that into an R03, or leveraging that into an R03. Okay. All right. I'll shut up.
Awesome. Well, thanks for being here today. It looks like I need to I'm good. I don't need to hit anything. Okay, great. So I'm Katie, and thanks for being here today. I feel really honored to be kicking off the in-person speaker series again. I'm not sure how I got slated into this position, but it really is an honor. So as Carl said, I'm going to be talking through a project I've been working on here and been able to work on it here through seed funding through IBS. So first, as Carl had mentioned, and as probably most people in the room don't necessarily associate me with the topic I'm talking about today, but with some broader universal prevention programs that we have in our prevention science program. So I work with Amanda Lane's team on the life skills training dissemination team, understanding how we can use all this process evaluation data they've been collecting for decades, literally, and what we can share and generalize, what knowledge we can generalize from that to the field. And then also working with Carl and Christine Steger on this cluster randomized controlled trial. As Carl mentioned, it's in schools, it's been during COVID, and it is so exciting and really actually, I think, a lot of fun, constantly problem solving. But these 2 projects really allow me to utilize statistical skills that I really love to do. I love analysis, and then also be involved in this really applied work on the ground to understand what works to make kids' lives better at a broad level. So the talk today really is like the specific content and population area of interest for me within prevention science. And again, that RDA has allowed me to kind of carve out some of that time. I'm going to give you a bit of background on me, and Carl kind of already gave you this, but it's important related to the topic, not so much because you need to know about me, but as Carl mentioned, my background, at least educationally and also professionally, is really centered very strongly in social work and in public health. So I did my PhD at the University of Denver here in social work. But I mentioned this related to this topic of sexual and reproductive health and child welfare because for child welfare, social work really owns that domain. When you think of child welfare workers, when you think of foster care, you think of a social worker, right? And we really own that space. That's our domain. That's our bread and butter. We do not own it. We like to very much avoid sexual and reproductive health. Please do not. We just, don't want to talk about that. Don't see it. Don't hear it. It's not in our curriculum. And I would say generally, not just in social work, but particularly the child welfare portion of social work, it's just a bit more avoidant and maybe uncomfortable. Conversely, in public health, sexual and reproductive health is kind of one of their bread and butters, and very comfortable with it. And at the same time, not that familiar with the child welfare system. So for me to come into this topic and the way that I see it is very much related to the fact that I've been in both fields and worked in both fields. And it took me being in both fields for several years to really get to the point where I see this gap and it impacts how I want to address the gap. And then finally, as Carl mentioned, I'm from Alabama. My family's all there. My mom's here from Alabama. I mentioned that because it really impacts who I think are the players and how we can work with lots of players to approach this topic. I'm going to try to not get into too many nitty-gritty details so that we have some time for questions at the end, which are more interesting anyway than slides generally. But I think it's important for me to explain who I'm talking about. This word child welfare is kind of vague and can actually mean a lot of different things. So for me, when I say it, I'm referring to youth who commonly have open child welfare cases. And what that means, what it takes to have an open child welfare case is that means that someone has seen a kid and has some concern. So it's a neighbor, it's a school, it's a nurse, and they think, wow, this family might need some support, or the kid may be in trouble, or there may be some abuse or neglect going on in the home. So they make a report to a hotline. And on the other side of that hotline is a caseworker or social worker, and they're going to do some sort of investigation. This often looks like a home visit, could be a phone call. It could be that it gets processed out even without those things, but some sort of investigation is done. And then that caseworker says, this family really needs some extra support, or this kid is really in, there's enough level of concern that we need to remove them immediately. But some sort of determination is made to either open that case and continue providing services, or to close the case and nothing else really happens. So it's that open child welfare case that really can result in a lot of different scenarios. I think we think sometimes child welfare and foster care get synonymous, and that's kind of true. Like all those cases are in child welfare. But the bulk of cases remain at home with their families. So in Colorado, the Colorado Child Welfare System here says that 70% of the families that they serve that have open child welfare cases, the kids are living at home safely with the family receiving services. I want to point out that this is a really unique group, and we're going to talk about how they're unique, but they are not rare. This is a lot of kids in the United States. About 1/3 of all children and half of African-American children will experience some sort of Child Protective Services report or investigation by the time they're 18 years old. The bulk of these probably happen at 0 to 5, but this is kind of the life course experience. And then if you look at removal, that foster care placement, it's about 6%, and that is a lot higher for African-American children and American Indian children. So what do we know about this group and sexual and reproductive health? I'll go ahead and tell you what we know, and then I'll get into details. But the reality is they have very elevated rates of pregnancy and parenting. That's what we know. And we know a little bit about risk factors for them. I'm just going to put a disclaimer that I'm saying sexual and reproductive health here, and that's a broad topic. It's a lot of different outcomes and indicators. But I'm really focusing on pregnancy, parenting, and contraception. So it's helpful first to know what's happening in the general population before comparing to what's going on within this specific group. And basically what we see is that teen births have been declining for decades now. And that's true also for pregnancy and abortion. So I think this is generally good news because we generally think of unintended pregnancy or early pregnancy as mostly being unintended. We think that this is happening, one, because of some economic factors that I don't know as much about, but we also think these declines are happening because, one, kids are having less sex, actually. They're deciding to wait a little bit later every year. The average age of first sex in the general population goes up a little bit, maybe contrary to general thought. And also we're getting better about getting education about prevention to kids, pregnancy prevention. And then also we just have better forms of contraception and kids are using these more effective methods. When we look at our child welfare group, what we see are that roughly about females are about 2.5 times more likely to experience a pregnancy. And that ends up equating to half of females will experience a pregnancy during their teenage years, so before they are 20, which I find to be staggering. And as far as we can tell, these rates are quite stagnant. It's really only been in the last decade that we've been able to kind of pinpoint a prevalence number for this group. There's a number of reasons why it's really hard to count this and to get some good numbers. But we have been able to do that with regional samples over the last 10 years. And it's seeming that it's just, it's staying where it is, unlike the general population. So why is this? A big reason is something that many in this room are experts on way more than me, but this idea of cumulative disadvantage theory. This is a group that experiences tremendous adversities. And that idea of risk and that idea of adversity accumulates for the short term and for the long term in life. And that also impacts the amount of resources, what kind of resources you're able to access as well. But it seems like it's more than just that. You know, if you match a group that looks just like these kids on all the socioeconomic factors and other demographics with youth who didn't have any child welfare involvement but had similar experiences, we still see difference, or the best evidence tells us it still seems like there's something else going on here. It's not just that they also experience a lot of poverty and all these other, low parental education, all these things that are associated with outcomes that like early pregnancy or substance use, a host of other outcomes we can think of. A theory that is really common and one that I subscribe to as well is that an additional piece, and big additional piece about this group is that they experience a lot of disconnection from systems that typically deliver services and prevention programming. So I'm going to say a little bit more about that within this kind of traditional prevention framework, because that's the framework I come from. Typically, when we deliver services for prevention programming, and this is really true for any kind of service, to reach youth, we use 3 main avenues, I'd say. One is schools, right? So our life skills training project within the prevention science program is a great example of this. We go into schools to deliver this evidence-based program. This is really common. This is really the best place to reach kids because that's where they are. The other big avenue is the family. So you can target parents, you can target that family unit to help kids. So a great example of this in our program is Christine Steegers writing a grant with Carl to test an intervention that is aimed at parents to help them communicate and stay connected to their kid who's transitioning to college. So another example of like how we can use parents to reach and give services and help kids. And then the last one is communities. So kind of these broader systems. Beverly Kingston's group and the Center for the Study and Prevention of Violence does this all the time with the communities that care models. They're really using that community infrastructure to build it up and say, how can we best support kids and families in your community? Youth and child welfare are disconnected from all of these. They're almost inherently disconnected from the family, from the parent, right? As part of being involved in this system. And that's not always true. So just want to say that, but generally speaking, notoriously, they miss a lot of school. They change schools a lot. So they're kind of missing links there. And if you're kind of disconnected from there, it's really hard to be connected to your community as well. However, I like to always point out one of the other unique things about this group is not so much the risk and the disconnection, but also a unique connection that we have to them, which is through the child welfare system. And it's really imperfect, but it is one of the few systems of being able to connect to this really disconnected group. So that's mostly what we know. So now I'll summarize what we know is that there's really elevated rates and there's a lot of talk about risk. What we don't know is we don't know hardly anything about their attitudes about sexual and reproductive health. So attitudes are what drive behavior. And we know very little about that. We know very little about contraceptive use. There's a little bit on that, a couple of studies. And we know very little about whether they feel like or if they have access to services. We're seeing these really elevated rates, but we don't know. Are they choosing not to use it? Do they just not know it? We don't really know why. And then I like to think of it as well if within subgroups. So there's topics we don't know about and there's subgroups we really know nothing about. If you'll remember, all the stats that I gave you earlier are about females. And that's about those are the groups we know about. We don't know a lot about younger adolescents. We know very little about males because a lot of the data we've been linking is from birth records. Birth records often don't have the father in a number of these cases, or sometimes that's just missing data. And then we also don't know a lot about the majority of youth who are involved in the child welfare system who are not removed from their home. So a lot of the child welfare studies have followed youth who have been removed. In our national kind of general population survey, let's take National Survey of Family Growth, great information about contraception. It's really hard to identify who has child welfare involvement. You might be able to note and see someone who has been placed in foster care, but it would be really hard to tell if that kid is in a family that's receiving child welfare services or if they've ever been placed in foster care, if that makes sense. So I've had this SEED award to look at this topic. We published a paper on Wave 1 data. I'll describe the data in a minute. So we kind of have some preliminary data. And then I wrote a grant, a small, really small R03 to the National Institutes of Health to kind of look at things longitudinally. Before I get into that, though, I also want to point out why contraceptive access. Like, why is this so important? Like, obviously, all the indicators I've been talking about are pregnancy and parenting, right? Our goal to this point, and I think our whole field has, where we're realizing, like, wait, reducing pregnancy isn't actually the goal. The goal is having a group of youth who have very little agency and autonomy over so many things in their life, for them to feel like they have reproductive agency and autonomy, for them to actually have that. And pregnancy and parenting, those outcomes are actually not great measures of that. They might be indicators, but for this group particularly, this topic is quite complicated. And there's a lot of reasons why it's complicated. There is also a narrative that there's a really strong attitudes around positive, being pro-pregnancy, that they feel very positive about having children. And that's very true. In my research, I found that if you ask, though, do you want to have a kid in the next year, you get differences. This is also a group who in a lot of the qualitative research, not a lot, there's some qualitative research on this, but all of it really points to this idea that youth feel like even if I wanted to plan a even if I didn't want a pregnancy, it wouldn't matter. It's inevitable. It's unavoidable. And that's tragic. That's really tragic today. So the goal is really to shift this so that they feel like they have autonomy over their life. And that is really important because, again, okay, I think it's working. Well, just let me know. So the best work, the best evidence on this is by Amanda Stevenson here in our building, such a powerhouse on this topic, who showed, you know, we've kind of had this belief, Ruth Bader Ginsburg has like really set the stage of like, women have to have, you know, reproductive autonomy in order to have socioeconomic freedom, basically. But Amanda Stevenson and team here at IBS really showed empirically with really strong data that this is very much true. So they were able to show that the expansion and access to contraceptive methods here in Colorado resulted in a population level increase in high school graduation rates. So this wasn't about kids who use contraception versus those who did not. It's literally at a population level, having this sense of having greater access really shifts at a population level what you think your life course is going to look like. I have this picture of Sister Song up here. They're the group that kind of termed reproductive justice that's really shifted us in this direction. So just want to kudos there. So I'm using a study that I worked with throughout my PhD program called Fostering Healthy Futures for Teens. It's a regional study here in Colorado, a randomized controlled trial of a mentoring and skills training intervention. The principal investigator on it is Heather Talsig, who was my advisor in my PhD program and continues to be a phenomenal collaborator for me. I have to mention Rachel Bennett, who's in the room here, who was the project coordinator of this entire project and actually got a lot of data for me, I think, for this grant proposal. So appreciate you. But we took teens who were entering 8th or 9th grade and had open child welfare cases. About 80% participated. This may not seem exciting to many of you in the room, but if you're familiar with child welfare research, particularly at this age group, it's really a great it's a great participation rate. And we were able to follow youth for 2.5 years and had really, really high or very low attrition rates as well. So it's a small period of time, 2.5 years, but it's a wildly changing period of time from, you know, that 8th grade into high school. And then finally, we had really rich measures. We interviewed these kids for, these interviews lasted 3 to 5 hours and covered everything under the sun, in addition to a lot of questions around contraceptive access and use. So just a peek at the sample, the average age, this is at wave 1, that baseline point. A little more females than male. About half are in home versus, so living with biological parents versus out of home care. The majority at wave 1 were not sexually active, which is really great from my point of view, because I think we need to start catching them and understanding what's happening before they decide to start engaging in sexual activity. And then these numbers don't add up to 100 for race and ethnicity because this group of youth is incredibly diverse, and they really make you understand that race and ethnicity is not a single box to check. This is a challenge for me analytically, but it's also just a really beautiful sample that is similar to samples that we see across the United States in child welfare. So Colorado is a very white state, but we pulled from, you know, probably some of our more diverse counties, and we have samples that look pretty similar to others. This is the paper that we published in the Children and Youth Services Review. It was a really basic paper, really. We felt like there was such a dearth of information on this topic. We really just wanted to give some descriptives out there and look at some very simple bivariate differences between some demographic factors. Our big goal with this was to be strengths-based and to not talk about risk, but to talk about what was protective and what might lead to healthy decision-making, healthy sexual health decisions. This is kind of a lot, and this is sort of like the paper. It was just like a smattering of descriptives. But I'll just point out that like these are 2 items we had on contraceptive access. We have a couple more, but basically when we looked at, had youth received any information, any formal from your school or from a parent, from an aunt, any information about birth control or family planning? About a third, and then just a little bit more than that said they could get services. They would know where to get services if they wanted them. I'd say that's pretty low. The average age of first sex for this group is about 15. The average age of this sample is 14. So I think we want that to be a little higher when they're on the cusp of that. So, but if you keep looking down at their attitudes, so the agency to avoid sex if I don't want to have sex, or what my friends think about the importance of using condoms, these are all pretty unequivocally strong, or what we would think of as in a protective direction. And then we also looked at basically this positive negative expectancies are really about what you see as the risk or the reward of having unprotected sex. And for the most part, most kids felt like, I'm not going to get that much of a benefit out of having unprotected sex. And I know these numbers are a little flipped and a little confusing on the negative piece, but for the most part, they're saying, I think I'd probably have some sort of consequence, some sort of risk if I did engage in unprotected sex. So we also looked at some differences by demographics. Biological sex, the differences between males and females, was definitely the biggest. So as we all might expect, right? So for the most part, females are about twice as likely to either have received information or know where to get services. And then males perceived that unprotected sex would probably have higher chances of benefits for them and lower chances of a consequence than females. I'm sure we all expect this, but to me, it is such a wake-up call. You have a group of youth who think there are greater chances of benefit and lower chances of a consequence. And that's the group that's receiving half, who are less likely, so much less likely to be getting education and information. It's such a call to me that we really need to be intentional about bringing young men into these conversations. Similarly with older versus younger, it's the direction you would expect. Older kids are more likely to know about things. But interestingly, younger adolescents perceived lower chances of a consequence from unprotected sex. I really think that that is about the fact that younger adolescents likely don't know how STIs are transmitted, may not know how you get pregnant. And that's concerning. We want kids at this age to know how these basic biology functions happen, so that they understand, again, about being able to make the decisions that they want to be able to make. And then we also looked at differences by race and ethnicity. The big takeaway here, actually, to me, is that there were hardly any differences. But if you look, there were some differences based on benefits perceived by unprotected sex. And Black youth were more likely to think there would be benefits compared to youth who did not select the identity of Black. So not compared to necessarily a specific other racial group. And then Hispanic youth perceived lower chances of benefiting from unprotected sex. It's always important. I think the no differences, your null findings are findings. There were no differences between kids who were living at home with their biological parents or living out of home. And basically all the kids have very similar sense of agency to avoid sex if they didn't want to have sex, and peer norms around condom use. So my takeaways from this, just a look at descriptive statistics, are that one, not on the slide, but we got to include, we got to start being more intentional with males and younger adolescents. And then in the midst of all this talk of risk, because this is a group that experienced, again, so much adversity, there's really a lot of promotive attitudes. We do not need to be, we don't have to think about going into services and interventions or as a caseworker thinking that I need to get a youth to think a certain way. They think, I think, pretty positively, and I know I'm putting value judgments on a lot of these, but what we can focus on is not so much instilling the right attitude, but building bridges to services and education. I have no idea what time I'm at. Okay, thanks. I'll try to run through this. So our NIH proposal is really to try to look at these factors longitudinally. We want to dig into that contraceptive access piece longitudinally and dig into those open-ended questions that we asked about it. We want to identify predictors, what leads to these, what leads to contraceptive access. And then also how to, well, this is very exploratory because our sample is quite small, but we have some simple analyses to try to get a sense of if this relationship between predictors and contraceptive access are different for different groups, and if we should be tailoring how we approach these groups to promote contraceptive access a little differently for different groups. So I want to point out my collaborators and contributors. First, this is Heather Tausig, the PI on the original study, and is a consultant on this project and has been super helpful. Amanda Stevenson, again, just someone who's just so powerful in this area and producing so much important research on similar topics. It's just phenomenal to get to have her on this proposal. Carl, expert in risk and protective factors, has also been super supportive and helpful. And then you all may recognize Christine Andrews, who did our equity workshops, I think last summer now. She's a consultant on this project, and I'm so excited to have her. She's really playing a role around helping us with operationalizing like race and ethnicity in this really complicated sample, but also if and when we find differences or no differences by race and ethnicity, really being able to understand what that means for this sample, for these measures, and how to apply it to practice. And then I'm also working with a group called the Healthy Teen Network. I've worked with them on a couple of different projects. They have really worked with a lot of practitioners around sexual and reproductive health and do a ton of work around dissemination. And news alert, caseworkers, people who work in child welfare do not read published literature. So if we want, if there's any hope that our research is going to reach people who are doing the work in the field, we've got to be intentional about not just translating the research to their terms, but also disseminating it through the channels that they access. So the Healthy Teen Network is going to be on board to help with that. And then I just have to point out, Annie Maggiari, this is my first NIH proposal. So huge lift, and Annie just makes it so much easier. And we got to get a picture. I don't know if she's on here, but she needs a picture on the website. And then the CUPC boot camp, grant writing boot camp with Jason and Patrick was, I did it twice actually, one for the original submission and then again for the revision. And I just can't tell you how helpful it was. And you all should make sure to do that if you're going to be writing a grant, because it's an incredible experience. And then I feel like I have to acknowledge what feels like an elephant in the room. Since Roe v. Wade was overturned in our post-Roe context, this topic, I think, has never been more critical. And you have to realize that in states that have total bans, there's really no access to abortion for youth in foster care. So lots of people can try to go out of state, right? Or do telemedicine, all these things. But if your guardian is the state who has banned abortion, you can imagine how much more difficult that is. And a lot of states, including Colorado, which has pretty good access to abortion and contraception, they require require parental consent for minors. There's some ways around that. So sure, there's some exception to this. But for the most part, it is exceedingly difficult, and it's already exceedingly difficult for many people. So kind of as part of that, so I actually just received another seed grant through the CUPC to explore Texas social service providers' experiences around this topic since abortion has been really restricted in the state. So Texas is the largest state that's banned abortion. And we kind of feel like social service providers have been left out a little bit. And we're really a critical point for people who are the most marginalized. So this is true, obviously, for kids who are in child welfare. So I say social service providers, and that certainly includes child welfare workers are a big piece of that. But we wanted to expand it a little more to folks who are working in homeless shelters, domestic violence agencies, and like hotlines for sexual assault. So I'm really excited about that project. My collaborator is at the University of Texas in Austin and very much on the ground on this topic. So that we'll see what comes of that. And otherwise, thank you, and love to have your questions. I have no idea what time it is, so great. It is 12:46. Oh, perfect.
No, probably not.
Can we put the screen up? Yeah, I think most people are off camera, which is totally great. I get that. Oh, you're right. Okay, let's see. I think I have a chat here. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah.
Maybe it's easier if I ask my question, because this is Mimi, sorry. Because I was just really just like thanking you for doing this incredibly important work at this moment of extreme crisis. But I was back, you mentioned levels of sense of agency among the population, and but you didn't get into the weeds, and I was just really curious about what sense of agency looks like, if you have backup slides or any sense of that. Not hugely important.
Yeah, like how we're measuring it.
Repeat that part of your...
Yes. She was asking about how what sense of agency would look like. Are you asking about specific measures? Oops.
Partly measures, but more so like how many people report having a strong sense of agency, and then, unless you showed it and I missed it.
Yeah, so there's this item on agency. I kind of have described it as agency, but if you did not want us to have sex, how sure are you that you can keep from having sex? I think agency around contraception, though, I think of as like, if you wanted to get services, do you know how to do it?
So this is super helpful. I missed the stat there. And actually, like, if you flip it and think about the fact that about a quarter of youth aren't confident that they could, in this group, aren't confident that they could avoid non-consensual sex, that's pretty scary.
Right. Yeah.
Thanks.
This is a group whose experiences a pretty high amount of non-consensual sex. So it is, I think it is an important question. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I think it's a really realistic. I'm surprised that it's as high as it is. I can imagine reporting bias, but yeah, thank you.
Right. Yeah, we have something here. Sure. So good. Yeah. So someone's asking about what the flip side of this kind of maybe in my terms, maybe general population. So I think it's really hard to say because there are a couple of surveys who ask similar questions, specifically like, have you received information from either formal or informal services? And then do you know how to get services? In the National Survey of Family Growth, they don't start asking that question to youth until they're 15. So this group's a little younger. Actually, in this paper, I had this whole section of trying to compare, and we still do that a little bit. But because this is such a, it's not that much younger, but it's like it's enough younger that it's different. It's really hard to compare. And that's one reason that there's very little data at this age, is because even in the national surveys, a lot of times, most of them don't start asking until they're 15. What do they say? It's higher than this, and I can look in the paper and tell you, but it is a little bit, it's definitely higher though. I want to say it's like at least half, but I'm not, that may not be totally accurate. Half for sure. Yeah. Oh, avoiding sex. Yeah, so I was talking about the contraceptive access items. Actually, that's a comparison. I don't know I'm sure that there are national surveys out there that ask a similar question about avoiding sex, but I'm not familiar with them. Yeah. Oh, for sure. Right. Right. So in our sample here, yeah, there most of the rates are about females. Because and that again is related to, we have medical records about pregnancy or about births that are missing. So we think there's a lot of underreporting for males. In our sample, are you talking about compared to males or compared to general? Yeah, 2.5 times higher than youth who were never in the child welfare system, who were also similar on age and racial demographics. Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Let's see. Yeah, Jason, or go for it. Yes, Jason. Yeah. Love it.
That measure of embarrassment.
Oh no.
Question about which would be embarrassed if you became pregnant, or if you got something like and that was Steph's original work, and she used that as a great more to be embarrassed yourself to the eyes of others.
Yeah.
Then built on hers, and we look at a school level measure of embarrassment. And school norms were incredibly different as a function of region, class.
Oh, I bet.
We were able to demonstrate that both individual level embarrassment and school level embarrassment both predicted sexual activity behavior and then later subsequent teen pregnancy. And I'm curious when you talk about your items there in terms of agency, to what extent having norms of embarrassment, what I ought.
Yeah.
Would that help your framing?
For sure. Yeah, I think so. So I think most of that was caught by the computer on subscript. So I'll just assume that folks online could hear. Yeah, that sounds fascinating. I was not aware of that particular work, but yeah, it's certainly relevant and certainly be helpful. These are things that are pretty difficult to measure in general. contraceptive access is particularly complicated to ask about and ask. Yeah, Myron. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So Myron's asking about differences between males and females, and I think essentially like how we're thinking about messaging with females versus males. Yeah, what the prevention framework would be about that. Carl, I feel like that might be for you. I would say, I mean, that's so there's such a difference between like the formal messaging, so there are formal ways of education, and there's like the informal. And I'm not really sure. I think the informal methods are actually more powerful and probably more predictive. I'm not totally sure about that. Yes.
Said for things like what happens over the back fence is
right. Yeah, exactly.
Formal message is
mm-hmm. No, I think it is. I think it very much is. So again, did I push the button? Okay, yes, yeah, I know. I don't know if I can summarize. I know, I feel like I should. We're going to pass the mic next time. Okay. I definitely think informal sources are much stronger here. And I think that's really where you see the differences. Kids in the classrooms, the formal sources of sex education, they're all kind of getting it in 9th grade or whenever they get it. And it's that one day, and it's not that impactful anyway, right? It's that, what do my peers think about this? If you'll notice too, it's like more kids said I knew how to get services if I wanted them than they said someone's talked to me about this topic. So like the internet is a big, I think that's why we have more kids who say they know how to get services, because of the internet. But yeah, I definitely think the informal and like how that's like this broader social change that I think in prevention science, we don't do. We're not good at that. We're really not. We're really, I think much more at that like micro, the one-on-one level, or like a meso, maybe kind of community level. So I think it goes back to the sociologists in the room to bring some societal cultural change on that shifts our perspective of consequences aren't just for females, they are for males. And we actually do see that in a very similar sample we have on this. Our males who are parents are more likely to have a job and they make more money. And I think it's because they do feel a sense of responsibility. They have, they do want to contribute and be a part of their kids' lives. Do you want to go online, Cindy?
Sure. You want me to just repeat it? So one question is, did all school districts that the students attended sample offer sexual education?
Oh, good question. So did all kids get sex education in school in the sample? It kind of depends. In Colorado, there is a law that says if you teach sex education, you have to teach medically accurate, like comprehensive sex ed, but it doesn't say that you have to teach it. So it's a mix. I think for the most part, the counties that we were in, those school districts did teach some sort of comprehensive sex ed. But again, we've got kids going to 8th or 9th grade. So there's quite a mix around that. We actually did a sexual health course that I actually taught to the kids. This is super fun. So they got some there, but after baseline. Sure. Yeah.
I realize this is very recent, but do we know how Dobbs has affected young people's sense of control over their bodies?
Awesome question. So first of all, we know there is like not a single, I don't think there's a single paper on foster care and abortion. So in one of the papers I've talked about results of pregnancies and we give pregnancy rates. There's another regional sample that gives some of those rates, but there's literally nothing out there. My personal opinion, and there'd probably be debate on this in the field, I guess, but is that this is a group who never had access. It's very much the reproductive justice argument of like, legal or not, it barely matters. I mean, obviously there were kids who were able to get access before, but for the most part, it was so inaccessible to this group, even when it was legal, that I kind of wonder if like, the Dobbs decision doesn't even have that, you know, at a group level. Certainly it has impact for specific kids, and those are situations that are, you know, some of the most heart-wrenching. So I don't know to answer the question, and honestly, I don't know for this group that it makes a big difference. I think at a general population level, yes, I think it does.
And then technically we're at time, but a minute over, but there is one final question.
Okay. I haven't heard all questions, so I apologize if this is a repeat. In your sample, you discussed that there were differences in the education provided to male versus female youth, and thus a difference in the perceived risk consequence of them having unprotected sex. Were you able to examine the differences in perceived risk consequences among male versus female youth who have received equivalent education? Oh, that's a good question. No, we weren't, but that would be fun to look at. For sure. Yeah, that would be very interesting to look at. That's a great point. I'll do that. Get back to you. Wow, amazing. I'm sure. So the question was, when is sex ed taught in Colorado? I think it probably varies by literally every school, probably at the school district level mostly. I think 8th or 9th grade, definitely by 9th grade, I think we should expect the end of 9th grade, they should have had some sort of course on sex ed if they're going to get one. Someone, she was saying that in New York, they get sex ed in 5th grade. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so in 5th grade in Colorado, they do get birds and the bees basics. Okay, I'm wrapping up here. I'll stop this share here. Do I pass it back to you, Cindy, or? Okay. Okay, thank you all. Thanks for joining.
And also,